Hi everyone, I was going to do a follow-up to my last video, but for some reason Bible Code Wisdom is not working, and I needed to show some Bible codes in order to talk about the things I want to talk about next. But I just want to show you something interesting because, well, over here on the screen, these are actually Jesus's last words. They're coming up in Acts 1:8. And I just happened to notice this because I was actually looking at a video that I did some time ago about Nathan's testimony, because I was trying to find the video that I had talked about in my previous videos, and I had gotten it confused with some other videos that I did on Nathan. And this is one of the videos that came up that I was just watching, and this was a really interesting table. It actually came up with all of these terms. The word atheist came up in ELS form. You can barely see it probably, but it's over here with the letters A, T, H, E, I, S, T. So you have atheist. You have Nathan over here, N-A-T-A-N. You had boys over here in the purple. Died, saw heaven. Heaven comes up in the plain text. And then you had red, moon. All those came up in ELS form. And you have tetrad over here. It was the last blood moon of the tetrad where he had his vision. So you see the letters T, E, T, R-A-D over here. And so it was interesting that this came up in Deuteronomy 9:11, and that was the first verse that came up in the matrix, and it was talking about the end of 40 days and 40 nights. And in this video I was talking about the pattern of the 40 days and 40 nights, and how there were also, this was when Moses went up the mountain to get the 2 tables of stone, the 10 commandments. And so it's interesting that it comes up in Deuteronomy 9:11. So you have the number 9:11, because I believe this all represents DNA. I believe that the 10 commandments, the 2 tables of stone, represent DNA. That's the underlying theme throughout the entire Bible. But what I was talking about is how there's a pattern with the 40 days, and so I was showing Acts 1 in the video, and I noticed that you have here the same pattern that you have in Acts chapter 2, which I'll show you that again. But here in Acts 1, it's in verse 3 where it talks about the 40 days having passed since Jesus resurrected. This was just before he ascended into heaven. And then these are Jesus's last words over here right before he ascended. And starting from Acts 1:7, it says, "And he said unto them, It is not for you to know the times or the seasons which the Father hath put in his power," because they had just asked him if he was at this time going to restore Israel. So Jesus says, it's not for you to know the times or the seasons. But if you look at the words for times or seasons, you see that the word for times over here is the word chronos in the Greek. And so this word in the Greek actually means year, and I'll just show you that. First I'll show you what it says in the blue letter Bible, because over here it says that it means time, either long or short, seasons, and I'm sure it probably says year in here somewhere. Over here it mentions years old. But if you look at this word on Google Translate, I'll go ahead and put it in, you can see that it basically means, you can see that it basically means year. But you can see time over here also means time as well. But basically this word means year. So Jesus is saying, you do not know let me go back to it. Okay, he said unto them, it is not for you to know the times or the seasons. So he's saying it's not for you to know the year or the times. This word actually means times. I'll show you this word. And first I'll show you the blue letter Bible. It says do measure, right time, or measure of time. But if you put this word in Google Translate, this one will probably show time. And let me try it. Okay. I'll just copy and paste it. And I'll go back to Google Translate. Okay, it's saying weather or time. You can see it's saying time right here. Okay, so this is actually saying, Jesus said unto them, it is not for you to know the year or the time which the Father has put in his own power, because that's what those words mean basically. And so the very next verse is where this is his very last words that he spoke before he ascended up into heaven. And he said, but ye shall receive power after the Holy Ghost is come upon you, and ye shall be witnesses unto me both in Jerusalem and in Judaea and in Samaria and unto the uttermost part of the earth. And these were the very last words that Jesus spoke. And then when you get to verse 9, it says, and when he had spoken these things, while they beheld, he was taken up, and a cloud received him out of their sight. And while they looked steadfastly toward heaven as he went up, behold, two men stood by them in white apparel, which also said, ye men of Galilee, why stand ye gazing up into heaven? This same Jesus, which is taken up from you into heaven, shall so come in like manner as you have seen him go into heaven. So they're saying he's going to come back the same way he went up into heaven. And so the very last words that Jesus spoke before he went into heaven were in Acts 1:8, which makes the number 18, and this is just after Jesus said, it's not for you to know the year or the time which the Father hath put in his own power. So I'm not sure if this is a clue to the year or the time, but when you go to Acts chapter 2, you see that you have the same pattern with Acts 2:17 and 18, which is what I've talked about before, because in verse 17 it says, and it shall come to pass in the last days. And so these are the last days, and we're in the year 2018. It's just after 2017. And then it goes on to say, saith God, I will pour out my spirit upon all flesh, and your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, and your men shall see visions, and your old men shall dream dreams. And I will pour, and on my servants and on my handmaidens I will pour out in those days of my spirit, and they shall prophesy. So these would be the two witnesses that Jesus was talking about, that have the Holy Spirit poured out on them in the last days. And this is coming up in verses 2:17, which looks like 2017, and 2:18, which looks like 2018. And so when you go back to Acts 1, you see that same pattern with verse 7 and 8, which looks like 17 and 18. So Jesus is saying you don't know, it's not for you to know the year or the time. But then in verse 18, he says you will receive power and you'll be my witnesses. And then it goes on to say that Jesus is going to come back the same way that he left. He left in verse 18. Those were his last words. And then if you go down to verses 17 and 18 in Acts 1, you see this pattern again, except this is a little different, because over here in verse 18, this is actually talking about Judas, which is a type of the Antichrist. So it's talking about the death of Judas, and when Jesus comes back, that's when the Antichrist is going to be destroyed. He's going to be destroyed first, and then he's going to resurrect. Okay, you can see that here in 2 Thessalonians 2:8, which you see the same pattern again over here, but it's in verse 8 that it says, "And then shall that wicked be revealed, whom the Lord shall consume with the spirit of his mouth, and shall destroy with the brightness of his coming." And I used to wonder how or why the Antichrist would get destroyed immediately when Jesus comes back, but that was before I realized that God himself is the one that's going to give him the head wound when he crushes his head, just like was prophesied in Genesis 3 when he steps foot on the Mount of Olives. But then he's going to be cast out like an abominable branch, as it says in Isaiah 14. And so the world's going to wonder in amazement when this happens. They're going to think he resurrected, but God himself is going to cast him out of the grave. But you see the same pattern here in 2 Thessalonians 2:7 and 8, which looks like the year 2017 and 2018. And it's in verse 7 where it says, "For the mystery of iniquity doth already work, only he who now letteth will let, until he be taken out of the way." And there's different interpretations for that. But then just after that, you see the wicked is being revealed, and the Lord destroys him with the brightness of his coming. And so you have Judas being destroyed over here. This is when it says, "Now this man purchased a field with the reward money of iniquity, and falling headlong he burst asunder in the midst, and all of his bowels gushed out." So this is talking about the death of Judas here in verse 18. And just before that, in verse 17, it says, "For he was numbered with us, and had obtained part of this ministry." But then, of course, this happened to Judas, and then they had to replace him. Okay, so this 40 days here in this table was talking about the 40 days that Moses went up the mountain, which was Mount Sinai. But I had talked about this last year, how Moses went up twice for 40 days. But again, you see the same pattern in Exodus, because Moses went up the first time in Exodus 19, and then it's actually in verse 8. Well, it was in verse 2 through 7 where God gave the 10 Commandments, or made the covenant with Moses. And then it was in verse 8 where the people said, "We will do everything the Lord has said." So they accepted the 10 Commandments in verse 8. And then I talked about how there's a pattern from Exodus 19:16 through 18 where it mentions the third day in verse 16, but then it's in verse 18 where Jehovah descended upon the mountain. Okay, and you can see that over here. And then when you get to Exodus 20 and verses 1 through 17, it gives the 10 Commandments. And then it was in verse 18, which looks like 2018, where you have the thunderings and lightning and the noise of the trumpet, and the mountain smoked. Okay, when you go to Exodus 24:18, you see this pattern again. You see that Moses went up the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights, once again in Exodus 24:18. And then you see it again over here in Exodus 34:28 is when it says, "So he was there with the Lord 40 days and 40 nights, and he did not eat bread or drink water. And he wrote on the tablets the words of the covenant." So this is when Moses wrote the second set of tablets, and it's coming up in verse 28. And you can see that here also, but it was in Exodus 31 verse 18 where God wrote the 10 Commandments, where they were written with the finger of God. So again, this was coming up in verse 18. Okay, so I just wanted to point that out because there seems to be a pattern with the 40 days and the numbers 18 or 28, which I believe represent the year 2018. Okay, and as I've mentioned before, if the calendars are a month off, then the 40 days would be right around June 11th, and Pentecost would be June 18th. And then I've also talked about the significance of June 7th, which was Jerusalem Day on our calendar, and this would actually be 9 months from the Revelation 12 sign.